Hello, and welcome. Welcome back. If you were joining us for Writing with Richard, thanks for hanging out and waiting while we got reset for reading. Richard Reads here. So we're changing books, new book. As you guys know, last week we finished Broken Trust. And so we're circling all the way back to the sequel to Dissolution of Peace, which is the story that we read like way back. It was the first ones we read. It was the first one we read. And so I went on after that to write Volition Agent. And then from there, I went to write Broken Trust, and then I came around here to finish Illusion of Victory, which you guys can see the cover on the screen, but here's the cover in real life of the book. This is actually a brand new copy I have not ever opened before. I thought I had a second copy of it. I have one here that's never been opened and that I didn't want to. That's my original copy. And then I had this one, I guess. So anyway, what let's just go over like a quick recap. Not too many spoilers involved in Dissolution of Peace, because if you haven't read it yet, I invite you to go back and either read it. You can get it on Amazon, or you can listen to the Richard Reads from before. I plan to keep those up for a little while, and then I think what will eventually happen is I will pare them down, each of the Richard Reads, down to just a few chapters, and encourage people to go and purchase the book if they want to hear the whole thing. But for now, they're up in their entirety on YouTube, and so you can go back and look at that. But basically, what we have is we have Captain Serenity, who is the captain of in an Earth Navy ship, the Space Navy, of course, and she became kind of the center of what eventually became a war between the governments of Earth and Mars, including the discovery of some other races, other alien beings. And it ultimately ended with sort of a cliffhanger ending, and I don't really want to give the ending away, but Hoku, who's probably still in the chat, might remember the ending. It was rather abrupt ending, that cliffhanger. I'm gonna open this up. Again, I still can't see the chat, so I'm going to open up my Twitch app and look at it that way. I was able to see that cliffhanger because you wrote it in all caps, but I really don't want you to have to yell at me all stream. And I'm hoping Amy will be jumping in the chat soon too. I just saw her as I was getting ready. She was getting ready. And so, let's go here to my own channel. My channel. I am live, I know. I need to mute myself. I see here that we are quite displaying my bold spot right now. Okay, so now I should be able to see the chat. If somebody wants to throw a message up in chat to see if I see it, that would be really cool. And then we can start to get started. So I won't go into too much more detail. We start off this novel. This one can kind of throwing messages. Thank you, thank you. I think that this one can stand on its own anyway, despite the cliffhanger ending. I do know what was the yelling upstairs. Sorry if you guys heard that. So I'm going to read the back cover on this one here. Captain Christina Serenity is back from the dead, in a manner of speaking. Everyone believed that no one survived the devastating attack on the Earth spaceship Australia. That is, everyone except Roger Matthews, the traitor that launched the attack. But the 4 survivors have grown tired of seeking revenge and have returned home to face the consequences of that choice. The Zerkowans are losing interest in fighting Earth's war and demand some type of action against the threats that face their people. But after several tough decisions, Serenity learns that the term enemy isn't so clear, and she no longer feels strong enough to handle the weight of war. Can Serenity maintain the illusion of strength long enough to gain the victories Earth desperately needs? Or has the pressures of war and revenge already destroyed her? That is the back cover on this one. Inside, it's just got some praise from the first book, Dissolution of Peace. So, Sci-Fi Book Review said, lots of action, good emotional points, and I love the landscape. I left my soft chair and became a love-crossed, beautiful captain of a starship. The British Fantasy Society said, recommendation, read this if you feel like revisiting the golden age of sci-fi. Bookworm Babbling said, this book was a fantastic science fiction thrill ride. This book could very easily become a memorable sci-fi series comparable to Star Trek. And then we have another fellow author that said, tension, betrayal, love, lust, politics, action. This story has it all. That was Robert D. Marion, author of Danger Close. And Dissolution of Peace, I don't think I talked about this when I read it before. I tend not to brag sometimes about these kinds of things, and so I'm trying to get a little bit better about, at least, maybe not bragging, but at least sharing that I do achieve some accomplishments. But Dissolution of Peace was voted the top 10 science fiction and fantasy novel of 2012 in the Predators and Editors Readers Poll. And there's the Orangeberry Book Expo. It achieved in 2013. It achieved the Hall of Fame finalist. So, pretty cool stuff for that first book. And it talks about my other novels, which you already know about. And so this book, I published this in 2017. Wow, really? It's been that many years? That's what, 5 years now? No, 4 years? Wow. Get it together, Richard. Figure out your math. So anyway, as always, this is the first edition. I haven't made any revisions to it. This is the first one I think I published up here while I was in Washington. But as always, it's a work of fiction, names, characters, events, and places and products of the author's imagination, etc., etc. But anyway, yeah, this is one. The cover art was done by Sarah Jane, and I'm going to totally mispronounce the last name. Lehaux, I believe is how it's pronounced. Lehaux, I'm not sure. It's Lehaux. Yeah, I bought that cover art from that. And then dedicated the book at the time. My dad was still alive, which is, as people who've been following my stream for a while know, he passed away this year. But this book was dedicated to my dad. I'm glad he had the opportunity to read it before he passed. But it says, sharing a name with you has been one of my greatest honors. I love you, Dad. And then those of we that have been doing these Richard Reads for a while know that each of my novels has a quote to start. And this quote is from Corrie ten Boom. And it says, the first step on the way to victory is to recognize the enemy. And on the front cover, you may not be able to see it too well, but it does have right inside a breakdown of the ranks in the Earth military by branch. And I put them together like this. People had often asked, hey, I'm just kind of trying to understand the ranking structure of the Earth military, so I put it in there. All right, here we go. Chapter 1. Everything was just about perfect. Niagara Falls had been the obvious choice for the wedding, and getting it set up had not been that hard, even on short notice. Obviously, there wasn't going to be a very large attendance. Most everyone still thought they were dead. Michael Carlson straightened the tie on his tux and checked over his appearance one more time. He had wanted to see Christina one more time before the wedding, but she insisted that was bad luck. But we already have bad luck, Carlson had said. All the more reason we don't need more. I'll see you at the ceremony, Serenity had said before closing the hotel door. That had been just last night, and now Carlson stood in a small dressing room, about to be married to the love of his life. You would think this was a happy moment for him, but all he felt was dread. There was a knock on the door before it opened, sending a wave of the fresh scent of the falls. The refreshing scent of the fresh rain, though it hadn't rained recently. It calmed Carlson, just a little. Janice peeked around the door and then came in. Janice Canner looked absolutely amazing in the lavender dress that matched the color of his tie. It fit her well-maintained body nicely. She hated the color, but she wore it for Christina. You look nice. Carlson made his way to the chair to get the tux jacket. He looked at the L pistol sitting in the chair. His instinct was to take it with him, but that would only complicate things later in the day. This is a great day for you, Janice gestured to her own face in the form of a smile. Smile, Mike. You know what marrying Christina means to me, but you also know what it will mean for all of us. Carlson threw on the jacket, buttoned it up, and checked himself over in the mirror again. Enjoy your wedding. We knew it would end someday. I'm surprised we lasted this long. Janice put an arm around Carlson. When he turned around, she gave him a hug. As your best man, I order you to have a good time today. Carlson went to the door and held it open for Janice as she walked out. He looked around the room again and then closed the door. The falls could be heard echoing through the area. It was a short walk up to the wedding location. He used the time to catch his breath. You realize had we decided to do the so-called right thing, you wouldn't be able to marry Christina today, Janice said. I think you need to focus more on what you're gaining than what's about to happen. Carlson didn't respond to her. She was right. Carlson also knew he couldn't run from his fate forever. He'd rather face it with Christina than alone. As they got to the wedding site, he saw Francesca there in the same dress Janice wore. She smiled and gave Carlson a big hug. Francesca looked more natural in the dress, and she seemed to be much happier to be wearing one than Janice was. A man and a woman sat in the few chairs that were placed there. They had to be Christina's parents. Carlson had never met them, only saw pictures. He figured he better introduce himself before he married their daughter. He approached them slowly. As they turned around and saw him, they stood up. Christina was every bit her mother's child. The resemblance was so strong. The father looked hardened and rather angry. Creases in his forehead deepened as he made eye contact with Carlson. Carlson had faced some pretty bad people in his time with security forces, but this man scared him more than anything, including the time they hid from the Borvians in a swamp full of what Carlson could only describe as crocodiles mixed with scorpions. Given the choice, he'd rather have to deal with the earth crocodile. Carlson put out his hand. Mr. Serenity? The man took hold and gave him a stern handshake. I'm not sure I much care for you already. Michael, wasn't it? Mr. Serenity shoved him in the arm. Knock it off. I can imagine the whirlwind of emotions, Carlson said. Finding out your daughter is alive, and she's getting married. Christina insists that running away was her idea, Mr. Serenity said. But shouldn't you have been the one to stop her? Well, I didn't, Carlson came clean. We fought about it a lot, but I couldn't convince her, and I couldn't stop her. Mostly because I knew she was right. And she was, Mr. Serenity said. I just hate to see that she threw away her career. Better than her being dead, Mrs. Serenity said. She turned to Carlson. Don't worry about him. He was a career man himself, retired now, but always a good cop. Carlson hadn't realized that Serenity's father was once in security forces as well. Carlson wondered why Christina hadn't brought it up. Well, I'll apologize for the suddenness of our marriage, but I won't apologize for marrying your daughter. I've loved her for a very long time now, and only now can I finally marry her. Where is Luis and Lisa? Miss Serenity looked around, seeming to ignore Mike's words. They said they'd be here by now. She looked for her husband. She took her husband by the arm and dragged him off to find Christina's brother and sister. Carlson was relieved that was over, but it made his heart ache for his own parents, who had passed away long ago. There was no one attending this wedding for him. Well, that was interesting, Janice said. They wouldn't even talk to me. Carlson only nodded. Suddenly, his other worries subsided to a new realization. He was about to get married. His legs got wobbly and he stumbled to the rail and leaned against it. He felt nauseous for a moment, but it passed with one whiff of the air. He took a few more deep breaths. Janice and Francesca came up next to him. Are you okay? Francesca rubbed his back. Just realized I'm getting married, Carlson said over the railing. Holy shit. Just relax, man. Any minute she'll be ready for you and you can finally marry the woman of your dreams, Janice said. What if she doesn't come out? Carlson suddenly thought of Christina closing the hotel door in his face. What if that had nothing to do with superstition and she was giving herself a chance to escape her fate? What? Don't be crazy, Francisca said. I just saw her in her dress. You're going to fall in love with her again. Carlson turned around and faced them. He took several more deep breaths. Then he saw Janice was holding her security wallet. She was also holding on to the tiny diamond ring and a gold band Carlson had bought. Serenity was getting her engagement ring and wedding band today. There really hadn't been time to stop before. Mike, about the ring, Janice said. Carlson started to feel weak again. If Janice had lost the rings... Now hold on, Mike. Janice put a hand on her shoulder. You remember that little jewelry shop we saw all those years ago on shore leave? The Zercowan one? Yeah. Carlson paused a moment. He didn't remember well. Wait. No? Janice produced a shiny black metal ring with silver embedded in a wavy line throughout. Silver came out of the metal band at the top and held a clear gem. The gem appeared to be diamond, but the light didn't reflect off the gem the same way. It caused it to change colors. Mike had seen this ring before. Janice had wanted him to get it for Christina, but there was no hope of them getting married at that time. When the hell did you have a chance to get this? Carlson took it from her and looked at it. The gem changed red, then to blue as he moved it in the sun. I bought it that day, Janice said. I knew this day would come, and this was the perfect ring for it. I'd forgotten all about it, Carlson lied and went to hand it back to her. No, use it. Consider it a wedding gift, Janice said. She'll love it. The music started to play, and Carlson gave Janice a quick hug before running to his place. He nodded briefly to the officiant. Then the wedding march started playing. Carlson was glad he wouldn't have to wait for a bunch of people to take their seats. He wanted to be married, and as soon as possible. Serenity appeared on her father's arm. Carlson forgot about everything that was about to happen and relished that moment. The dress was simple, form-fitting, and made Serenity appear as though she floated to him. She moved like an angel, and the sun made her blonde hair shine. Carlson wore the most dumbfounded expression as Christina walked up and stood across from him. Christina smiled at him. He smiled back, and then they both turned to face the officiant. He nodded. Friends, family, we are gathered here to witness the union of Christina Serenity and Michael Carlson. This union is not a beginning, but rather a testimony to what is already here. Love. The officiant spoke clearly, his voice carrying further than needed for such a small group, but his official tone calmed Carlson's nerves. True marriage is much more than the joining of two people in civil union. Marriage is a testimony to the love, faith, and understanding that two people share with each other. The officiant turned to Serenity. Do you, Christina, take Michael to be your partner in life's journey, through love and heartache, health and sickness, good times and bad, for all your days together, joined by the common bond of marriage? I do, Serenity smiled. Carlson swallowed the lump in his throat as the officiant turned to him. Do you, Michael, take Christina to be your partner in life's journey, through love and heartache, health and sickness, good times and bad, for all your days together, joined by the common bond of marriage? I do, Carlson said. The rings? Carlson fumbled for both rings in his pocket, pulling them out. The stone's color was a light green and flickered a bit with yellow. He brushed the gem off. Serenity turned around from retrieving his ring from Francesca. Whoa, Serenity said. Seems Michael is full of surprises, the officiant joked. Serenity's family remained silent. They'd had enough surprise. May these rings forever be a symbol of your love you have shown here today, a small representation of the lasting bond between you both. With that cue, Carlson slipped the ring on Serenity's finger. She did the same for him. By the power vested in me by the government of Earth, I now pronounce you bound by marriage. You may now kiss. Carlson leaned in for a gentle kiss, but Serenity took hold of him and kissed him deeply. She pulled back slowly and whispered, I'm ready for what happens next. The officiant produced a small phone-sized device. Carlson used to carry one. It was a chip scanner. It was also what would alert the world on where he could be found. The officiants scanned their necks. Carlson's was first. He felt as though any minute now the world would crash around him, but he knew it would take at least a couple of hours. Carlson signed the screen, then Serenity, then Janice and Francesca as witnesses. It was official now. He was married to the woman of his dreams, and it was time for him to face the music. All right. So, little break. Nothing to catch up on chat. All right. The reception was small. Dinner at this top-notch restaurant with the few of them that were there. Christina's brother apparently had a huge problem with Carlson's career, but Janice had managed to diffuse that situation. Janice stepped outside for fresh air, and she found a bench to sit on. She was glad to be out of the dress, but she knew the fun was coming to an end. She checked her watch. It'd be any moment now. Carlson and Serenity came out next. They laughed a little, but when they saw Janice, they stopped. Serenity had turned her dress over to her mom. She didn't want it getting lost. Carlson still wore the tux, but the tie was undone and the collar unbuttoned. Francesca came out last. She insisted on paying for the meal and was setting up with the restaurant. She looked at her phone. It's about that time. Well, let's go. Carlson waited for the ladies to stand up. I say we get one more look at those falls before we go. They walked up to the falls, letting the time between them pass in silence. The joys of the wedding had passed, and there was a collective heaviness that Janice felt between them all. The last couple of years had been both pluses and minuses, but she was glad she spent it with them. She overlooked the falls. These were more Carlson's thing than hers. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate the beauty. She did. But she would much rather be somewhere else right now. The cascading water did little to drown her thoughts, like it seemed to do for them. She began to second-guess her choice to follow them in their pursuit of Roger Matthews. There was little she could have done about it. Francesca took her hand. Janice gave her a quick kiss. She had thought about asking Carlson if he would mind a double wedding, but she couldn't take this day from him. Besides, she'd already turned Janice down just a month prior. and they were still recovering from that. She was sure that Franziska was the person that pushed her into running. If Franziska had wanted no part of it, she wasn't sure she would have either. She knew that wasn't entirely true. She had a bond with Carlson now, something she never would have expected when she first met him. But now, not being near him was something she couldn't imagine. It was going to be tough. Carlson and Serenity held each other as they looked out on the water. Janice realized this was one of those moments that she would remember for a long time, or for however much longer she had. "Corporal Carlson," stern voice said. It said it more like a command than a greeting. "I haven't heard that in a long time," Carlson said as the four of them turned around. Janice already knew who would be standing there, though she had expected more of them. 4 security officers and a sergeant stood there. The officer looked over the 4 of them. "Captain Serenity, Ensign Willard, Officer Canner, and Corporal Carlson, you're all under arrest." Alright, that's the end of chapter 1. What do we think so far? Are we feeling like we're back in the story from all those months ago? Alright, let's move into chapter 2. Chapter 2. New Alcatraz was exactly what Serenity had expected from a prison on the moon. It was dark, the walls were tall, and the halls narrow. The cells were gray with no windows, and the bed was hard. She had no cellmate. She wasn't sure if that was a ploy to make her feel lonely, or it was a sign of respect. She noticed there were still some respects paid to her despite her being arrested. No formal charges had been brought just yet, so for all practical purposes, she was still a captain of the Earth Navy. She fidgeted with her ring finger. Naturally, they took away the new ring from her. Truthfully, she wasn't used to wearing it. She only had for maybe 12 hours before they processed her. But she did find herself missing Mike. She was also missing rum. But she'd given that up as a promise to Mike. But no matter how much she promised him, she still wanted just one sip. Right now, she could use a whole bottle. She could hear footsteps down the hall getting closer. Everything echoed in the cell block, so it was tough to tell what level the footsteps were on. She didn't expect to be on New Alcatraz already. She expected a trial, and there was the possibility of execution. But they processed her and brought her straight here. Perhaps they didn't want the world to know she was alive. They had been using her name as quite the propaganda machine since her ship, the ESS Australia, was destroyed. The footsteps stopped. Her cell door made a loud clank before sliding open. There stood 2 people she had not seen in years, and neither one looked happy to see her. Admiral Tracy Kelly was once her closest friend, but they grew farther apart as their career paths changed. Where Serenity had become content as one of the youngest commanding officers, Kelly had ambitions to rise to the top, a position she finally got when Mike and Janice had exposed McCorvick as the traitor he was. General Valentine stood just behind and to the left of Kelly. The General of Security Forces would typically be far too busy to see a simple matter like this. But given the nature of it, Serenity wasn't too shocked he showed up. "Captain," Valentine was the first to speak. "In all this time, have you forgot how to pay proper respects?" Kelly's voice was calm, in almost an unnatural way. Serenity stood up and rendered a salute. She held it while the 2 officers looked at each other. She knew they made her hold it longer than normal. When they finally returned the salute, Serenity stood attention and waited for the barrage of remarks to come her way. Valentine looked to Kelly. When she nodded, he stepped out of the doorway. Kelly stepped into the cell and approached Serenity. She looked her over once, then shook her head. I thought it couldn't possibly be you. Kelly walked slowly around Serenity. There was intel that said you might be alive, but I just couldn't picture you throwing your whole career away. Serenity didn't speak. It was a question, and clearly Kelly expected... It wasn't a question, and clearly Kelly expected strict military discipline. Kelly turned to leave the cell. Come with me. Serenity followed Kelly out of the cell. She looked to see 2 security forces officers following behind her, and General Valentine ahead. These weren't prison guards. She could tell they were protective services, the same thing Mike used to do. Kelly kept a hushed tone, and she spoke now. I'm not supposed to say this, but I'm damn glad you really are alive. Serenity stayed quiet. She was glad to see that Kelly was still the admiral. It was originally assumed her promotion was a PR stunt, and she'd be set up to step down rather quickly, especially with the war going on. But either she managed to make good choices, or they still needed her. Well, I wanted you to know that before we got down to the interview room, Kelly said. Serenity expected it was more likely to be an interrogation room. Serenity had no plans to get to the point where she had to suffer use of force to get information from her. She'd tell them just about anything they wanted to know. The rest of the walk was filled only by the sound of their shoes clicking on the hard floors. The interview room was white, with a small table and 3 chairs. There was a mirror on the wall, and Serenity wondered who was watching her through it. They sat her down in a chair, handcuffed her to the table, and took the seats across from her. She thought it odd they restrained her now, when she had just been free to walk with them a moment ago. She suspected it was more psychological games. Serenity actually was most worried about her friends. She had not seen or heard anything about their fate since arrest, and she was worried Mike may be too stubborn and they'd just kill him. She hoped Francisca could get away with just following orders routine, but doubted it. And Janice? She would probably find herself in the same situation as Mike. But if she shared her worry, or even asked about them, she was worried they'd use that against her. She planned to be forthright with them, but you never know what might happen. You do realize what this looks like, right? Kelly said. The Navy star captain goes AWOL for years and then suddenly shows back up. People are going to want to know what made you decide to leave. Serenity sat quietly, maintaining eye contact with Kelly the entire time. So what happened? Valentine stated. You mean why did I leave? Serenity asked. Valentine nodded. That was a complicated question. There were many reasons she took off and her on her own in pursuit after Matthews. She kept the answer simple. I wanted revenge. And why couldn't you do that with the Navy? Valentine asked. First, the Navy has made it clear to me before that my need for revenge was not welcome, nor should it be. Second, the Navy has made it clear that Matthews is not their concern anymore. Third, I didn't want to be involved in the war after seeing my entire crew lost in the blink of an eye. Serenity took a breath. I could go on for a while, but the thing is, I didn't care about the Navy at that moment. I cared about getting Matthews. You threw away your career, a distinguished and honorable career, for one man, Kelly inquired. Serenity knew they wanted her to say it. They wanted her to acknowledge that she had given up what she had given up, but she didn't care about that at this time. I threw away a job, Admiral. It was just a job. Admiral Kelly leaned in closer. Do you really believe that? Not anymore, Serenity stated dryly. I was blinded by revenge from what I saw. Serenity took in a big breath. Do you know where I was when the Australia was destroyed? Kelly sat back. She shook her head. Serenity sat back, took a deep breath. Even after time passed, she hated reliving it. She felt the tears well up in her eyes and the tightness in her chest. She wanted that drink again. I just had my meeting with you about Zimmerman. It hadn't gone well. Well, I was on the shuttle back, one that was about to start docking with the Australia. Just far enough to avoid being noticed, but Serenity looked down to hide the tears. But just close enough to see it all. I should have been there. I should have been on that ship. The Australia was my ship, and I should have been on her. And if I had been on that ship, you'd be dead too, Valentine said. There was nothing anyone could have done to stop that from happening. Serenity leaned down to use her restrained hand to wipe her face. I know that, but it doesn't help to know it. I still should have been there, but after seeing that, all I saw was revenge. Serenity sat back in her chair. I was already angry with the Navy for how they treated Zimmerman, and now the one thing I loved about being in the Navy was destroyed. Did Corporal Carlson or Officer Canner ever try to stop you? Valentine asked. Serenity wanted to lie for them, but she also knew they would come clean and expose what she said as lies. She decided to stick to the truth. They tried to talk me out of it. Lord knows Mike and I fought about it a lot, but they never tried to arrest me. They were as angry and as upset as I was. Serenity has spent plenty of time at the bottom of the bottle, and she remembered fighting with him several times. There were points she thought she would leave him, but how do you leave someone when you have to share a tight space with? And how can you imagine facing life without him? Oh, and now she can't imagine facing life without him. Let's talk about your husband, Kelly said. How long has that been going on? Serenity turned to Valentine. Do you remember when McCorvick called for a disciplinary hearing against Corporal Carlson? And you may remember that question about our being involved was raised? What you may not realize is I avoided answering that question. That long? Valentine rubbed his head. You certainly are full of surprises. Kelly pulled out a thick tablet of paper. Why did you come home now? Why not stay away? That was an easy answer for Serenity. After a certain amount of time passes, revenge starts to seem silly, and you start to realize that getting revenge won't make your own demons go away. And when I realized I was no longer doing what I thought was right, it seemed it was time to do the right thing and turn myself in. But you didn't turn yourself in, Valentine said. I could have got married on any of the Minis or Cowan worlds, yet I came home, where they would scan my chip and alert you to my presence, Serenity said. And by the off chance you hadn't flagged our chips, believing we were still dead, we would have been in the next morning. So you knew there was a possibility we knew you were alive? Kelly asked. With the amount of noise we made, I was certain someone had said something, Serenity said. Kelly looked to Valentine and they both stood up. They walked to the door before Kelly turned to look at her one more time. Someone will be in to get the full details on your whereabouts. Please be cooperative. Scene break time. Admiral Kelly walked into the next room. The psychologist and 2 security forces officers sat inside. The psychologist was looking over his tablet screen. He added a few more notes before looking back through the 2-way mirror. Kelly looked through the mirror at Serenity sitting there. She didn't at all seem like the confident, fiery captain she remembered. She looked defeated and worn down. Serenity had given up. And that was a shame. 2 men entered the room with Serenity. They sat down and began asking her questions about the last few years. Kelly turned away. It didn't really matter what mattered to her at this point. What mattered to her was why she'd done it. So what do you think? Kelly said to the psychologist. Sounds a lot like PTSD. He never looked up from the readings on his tablet. Post-traumatic stress seemed logical, and she hoped the doctor might suggest it. It gave her some way to justify what Serenity had done, and it gave her a reason to get her out of this place. You do realize the spot this has put the Navy in, the psychologist said, finally looking up from his tablet. The first thing the people are going to want to know is how she wasn't dead. Kelly understood the issues. If she told the world she was alive, they'd have to admit she was AWOL. Or they'd have to say they knew she was alive and then admit they used her for propaganda. Kelly hoped to invent a third option. Right now, I just need to justify her actions, and PTSD may be a good start. Kelly watched Serenity. She wasn't arguing with them at all. I told them not to use her name, but Naval Command insisted her death. Well, her death rally would rally the world to her cause. It worked pretty well, if you ask me, the psychologist said. Kelly may be the admiral of the Navy and supposedly the top dog, but the bureaucracy of the Navy wasn't that easy, and there had been steady pressure to get her to step down or resign. She'd done what the Navy needed her to do: regain the trust of the people and lead them into war. She suspected the real pressure would come when the public started to get sick of the war. It was not going well, and Earth was losing a lot of people to gain very little Martian soil. And when it came time for a person to take the fall, she suspected they'd rope her into the blame somehow. All she wanted to do was reach retirement, and she had a long time to go for that. She was far too young to be an admiral, and she was starting to see why. Leadership was something for the old. It was too stressful to handle for more than a few years, and war only made it harder. "Send me your report," Kelly said to the psychologist. She turned to the guards. "Make sure the captain is treated well, within the rules." They nodded. She left the room. It was time for her to get back to the planet. She could help her friend the best from there. Janice had managed to get the guards to tell her that her friends were still alive. Francesca and Serenity were still locked up in the segregated unit. Carlson was somewhere in general population, but he was still being kept away from other prisoners. Janice was getting much the same treatment. They were cops, and the last thing she wanted was to run into someone she'd put away. Technically, they weren't being jailed yet. There had been no trial. There would be, unless someone intervened, but right now, they seemed intent on questioning them. Janice suspected most of the questioning was over. She told them everything they wanted to know, but only after they told her what she wanted to know. She played a little game with them, but at least she found out what was going. Her cell door slid open and 2 guards stood outside. "Follow us." She said nothing as she followed them out of the room. It was about time for her to get her outside time, though she would have preferred to stay inside. The atmosphere dome over the prison may have provided air, but there was no blue sky, just darkness. Even with the light from the sun, it felt so dark. She stepped onto the yard. She saw someone with their back turned to her on the other side. "Mike?" She turned around. Carlson turned around. He looked shocked to see her. "Janice?" That was Francesca. Janice turned around to see Francesca just walking out. The 3 of them came together and exchanged hugs. As Carlson hugged Janice, he whispered, "They have to be listening." He was right. They would be listening. Why else would you put them all together? She smiled at him. "It's good to see you too." She went back to Francesca and hugged her again. Janice kissed her and then looked back to the door. She expected to see Serenity come walking out. She never did. "I know she is okay, Mike." Janice turned back to see his crestfallen face. Carlson nodded. "I miss her, and they know I do." "You've been cooperating, haven't you?" Francesca said. "I told them everything." "I have too," Mike said, "but that doesn't mean they don't want to make sure. This has to do with the fact that they don't want to recognize your marriage. It is a punishment for that." Janice didn't think that was right. Carlson waited so long on doing the right thing. Then he tried so hard to keep things under wraps so Serenity could have a career. And then he waited until they got back to Earth. He had waited long enough, and now they made him wait longer. "I'll be all right," but Carlson's face told her he didn't mean that. Janice also wondered if the reason they were allowed to see each other was because this was the last time they would. She held Francesca's hand and started to walk. She gestured for Carlson to come along. "No, you two go ahead," Carlson said. Janice was about to ask if he was sure, but he nodded his head. It didn't feel right to leave him standing there alone, but he waved for her to go and walk, so she did. That's the end of chapter 2. See if we have enough time to get through chapter 3. Even if we don't, I think we can at least get to a scene break. Yeah, so we'll read chapter 3. Get into food, Amy says. Yay! Yay for food. Food. All right. Chapter 3. But first I need a sip of water because my mouth is pretty dry. Chapter 3. Carlson was fairly sure they were not going to charge him with any crime. There was no other reason it would have been 3 weeks and still no trial. This was more of a matter of torture now. They didn't need to beat him or deprive him of food. They'd figured out they could just deprive him of Christina, and it would be enough. And it worked. He was on edge. They told him nothing about her. They would tell him all about Janice or Francesca when he asked, but say one word about Serenity and they just closed the door. Carlson realized that this was his punishment, which meant they had every intention of returning him to duty. They just wanted to make it clear what would happen if he thought of going AWOL again. He had no plans of doing that again, but if he did, he wouldn't come back to Earth again. Carlson stood up and started walking a few laps around his tiny cell. This would at least get the blood moving. He certainly missed the freedom to move as he pleased. He figured the government was trying to find a good story to make up about where the 4 of them had been. They'd need Carlson to cooperate with them, which probably had a lot to do with the treatment they were giving him, and he suspected Christina was getting it too. One of the guards walked up to the clear cell door and just looked at Carlson pacing. Carlson purposely ignored him. There was no point trying to talk to him. He couldn't tell Carlson anything he didn't know. "The general wants to see you," the guard finally spoke. "Yeah? Well, tell him I'm a little busy right now," Carlson said. "I mean, my schedule's packed." The guard rolled his eyes, then had the cell door opened. He didn't restrain Carlson. Sometimes they did, other times they didn't. Carlson walked out of the cell. Another guard stood down the hall as he headed towards him, the first guard on his heels. "I wonder what General Valentine wants," Carlson said. The guard remained quiet. He didn't expect them to say much to him. Carlson had wanted to yell or even act up with the guards. He was on edge and felt like he was near breaking point, but he also expected this might be what they wanted, which was probably why the general wanted to talk to him now. The door to the elevator opened and Carlson was ushered in first. The one guard stayed. The other, who followed him, continued into the elevator with him. When the elevator door closed, he spoke. "Listen, Corporal. I know you're on edge, and you didn't hear this from me, but all this is just about over for you." Carlson started to speak, but the guard raised his hand. "You're friends too, so before you lash out at someone, please just try to remember you'll be out soon." Carlson nodded. The elevator door opened and the guard escorted him to the first interview room. This was different than the others they had used. The walls were pastel blue rather than stark white. There was no two-way mirror in the room, though Carlson knew they were still listening. And the table and chairs were much nicer. A tablet of paper and a wax pencil, more like a crayon, sat on the table. Carlson took a seat. He had expected the general to be waiting for him. but he wasn't here. The chairs were much more comfortable than anything Carlson had sat on, so he wouldn't mind waiting a little while for the general. The guard left and closed the door. He heard it lock from the outside. He looked around the room for anything to focus his attention on. The edge had subsided a bit with the guard's words, but he still didn't know how much of it was true either. Carlson took a pad of paper and looked at it. He tore the paper off the wax pencil and began rubbing it sideways on the paper. As the words that were indented on the paper revealed themselves, he hoped he might find something worth reading. It kept his mind busy anyway. As he finished, he looked over the words. Not much came through, but the words, "Report to Naval Command Seattle," were clear. Then, at the bottom of the page, "Mike," followed by 3 question marks. Carlson tore the paper off and tucked it in his pockets. The door clicked and the general walked in. Carlson stood at attention and saluted. The general walked over to the other side of the table and set down a tablet. He pulled out his chair, then finally looked at Carlson. "At ease. Sit, please." Carlson sat down. The general thumbed through the screens on the tablet, making no attempt to hide that he was looking at Carlson's service record. Finally, he sat back and spoke. "Listen, Mike, I get it. You fell in love with Captain Serenity. Love makes us do dumb shit. My own wife drives me nuts sometimes, but I do just about anything for her. And we know full well how long this has been going on now. But that's all the past. Serenity was a one-of-a-kind woman and didn't deserve to be spoken about like she was some type of temptress. Your record up until you went AWOL was one of the best in the force. You took down a high-ranking Navy traitor, for Christ's sake. And we can easily overlook this issue of relations with the person you were protecting, a ranking officer of the Navy." Carlson simply nodded when the general paused. There was another shoe about to drop. "But going AWOL? How do we justify that?" The general gave Carlson a look that told him he was about to speak. He was supposed to speak. "With respect, sir, this isn't about me going AWOL. AWOL is anything but rare. It is the fact that you've been spouting about our deaths and that there were no survivors from the Australia, namely my wife's name. But the rest of us are an issue too." Carlson tried not to sound disrespectful, but it most certainly came out that way. "They already know you're alive. How do you explain that to the public?" The general shook his head. "They already know you're alive, thanks to that new mother-in-law. It appears she felt inclined to share your wedding photos with the press. Fortunately, no one can say that we knew you four were alive because we didn't, and so far no one has bothered to mention AWOL. Mostly because of the media laws. They can't say what they don't know." The general picked back up the tablet. "I like you, Mike, and I still do. I know you're on edge, and you're upset about the lack of information on Captain Serenity." "My wife," Carlson said. "You keep avoiding calling her my wife, but she is now." "Mike, relax, will you?" General Valentine flipped through some more screens on his tablet. Carlson couldn't see what he was looking at. "You're being removed from protective services for reasons you well know. I'm putting you back on patrol assignment with no loss of rank or pay. At this point, I think it is in the best interests of your career if you simply fade into the background. I'm not saying you don't do the best job you can, just do it quietly." "You mean stay out of the news?" Carlson said. The general nodded. It was a relatively light punishment, considering. Carlson finally sat back and relaxed for the first time since the general entered the room. But Carlson also knew his mother-in-law was to thank for this. People were bound to start asking where he was soon, if they hadn't started asking already. "As far as the public is concerned, you were held for a debriefing. Your AWOL will be noted in your file, and as such, you will have a negative effect on any attempts to get promoted." The general nodded to the pad of paper. Sorry, guys. As far as the public is concerned, you were held for a debriefing. Your AWOL will be noted in your file, and as such, will have a negative effect on any attempts to get promoted. The general nodded to the pad of paper. I have your orders. Carlson took the pencil and slid the paper close to him. Okay. You're to report to the South Africa headquarters building in Cape Town. There, they will assign you to one of their regional patrol offices. You are to report directly there when you are released from here. They will go over anything you need to know. Any questions? The first thing Carlson wanted to ask was why he was being stationed so far from his wife. That wasn't something they would typically do. In fact, it was the opposite of normal procedure. Do you remember what you told me after the McCorvick trial? Carlson asked instead. I think letting you go without any official jail time is favor enough. Valentine sat down his tablet. Don't push it. Sir, you were going to let me go anyway. We both know that. Your goal now is to keep the media as out of this as possible. And holding me any longer or charging me with a crime wouldn't do that. So you really aren't doing me any favor. You're doing this for security forces and the Earth government, Carlson said. And my favor is simple. Just change an assignment. Valentine let out a sigh. I'm listening. I prefer the rain, and where it doesn't get so hot. I was thinking that being assigned in Seattle might suit me a lot better. I used to work there and I loved it, Carlson said. Seattle? Really? Valentine picked up the tablet. I'm not sure. How about the London office? England has a very similar climate, and I have plenty of openings. Besides, it'll be something new for you. That is true, Carlson said. He started to write London on the paper, then stopped. But wouldn't that kind of be setting me up for failure? I mean, how many worldwide news agencies are in London, with the Prime Minister being there and all? Valentine gave a sly smile. He tapped in some information on the tablet. Fine, Seattle it is, but no more favors. I think this makes us even. Carlson nodded. He tore off a sheet of paper. If that is all? You'll be released in the morning, Valentine stated. Good luck. Carlson nodded and started to walk to the door. The door clicked open, and the same guard stood there. One more thing, Corporal, Valentine called out. The paper in your pocket? Leave it. Carlson took out the paper where he had shaded and set it on the table with only the slightest smile cracking on his face. Valentine huffed a small laugh. We got just a page and a half on this after this scene break, so we're going to wrap it up. I know we're at 7 o'clock, but sometimes we got to go a little over, and we'll finish up chapter 3. Of course, it would be raining when Serenity's shuttle landed at the naval headquarters in Seattle. Typically, it wouldn't have bothered her, except for the fact that she was hoping to see blue sky after all that time in the dark. But this was the assignment they'd given her, and at least she wasn't losing her rank. She had mixed feelings about being assigned a desk job. She really wanted some time on Earth. She'd spent too much time away. But sitting at a desk from now until she retired didn't sound like that much fun either. But Admiral Kelly was insistent this was the best way to keep her out of everyone's view. She walked into the terminal building and found the directory map. The campus was large, and she had to check in at the housing building. She'd probably just have them stick her in some on-site housing rather than taking on a rent payment. Without Mike around, there wasn't any point in getting a house. Serenity checked her watch. She had some time. She didn't want to seem too eager, because she wasn't. She looked for the campus cafeteria. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be the best meal she had, but it would be far better than anything they served her on New Alcatraz. She took out her phone, which the Navy issued her, and turned it on. As the phone powered up, she started heading in the direction of the cafeteria. She wasn't far off. She didn't like being separated from Mike, or even Janice and Francesca. But what bothered her most was not knowing. She didn't know if they were still locked up, where they were going, or any of that. She felt a weight crushing on her chest as she thought of them. She hadn't felt a weight like this since she saw the Australia destroyed. At least, Admiral Kelly confirmed, Mike was alive. She was told Janice and Francesca were alive as well. But she had known that for some time now. It was Mike they hid from her until her release. She had grown a deep resentment for the Navy and security forces, but she really had a festering anger with her one-time friend. Admiral Kelly was a bitch, and that was all that she could be. She had a family and had to know what it was doing to Serenity to isolate her from Mike, and to give no explanation as to why. That really set the divide in motion. Fortunately, the Admiral of the Navy rarely bothered to deal with any of the office staff at the regional offices, so she was unlikely to talk to her again. The cafeteria was virtually empty. The room was surrounded by windows out to the central courtyard with a fountain in the middle. The fountain was off. The rain could be heard very clearly. Standard issue tables and chairs filled the room. To the right was a stack of trays and the food line. There was a group of officers talking about some mundane topic in the corner of the room. Two more men in business suits were getting food. Serenity took a tray and went down the line. She took a muffin, a fruit bowl, and a bottle of milk. She didn't really feel as hungry as she thought she was. She didn't pay much attention to the cashier and scanned her payroll card for the food. She took a table as far away from everyone else in the room and sat her tray down. As she sat, she stared at the muffin for some time before finally taking a bite. She took out her phone and started looking through it. She tried to access the naval records, but her old credentials didn't work. No doubt they would give her new ones to her at her briefing. She would at least be able to contact Francesca then, and it would stand to reason that Francesca would be in contact with Janice. She set the phone down and took a bite of the muffin. It was actually pretty good, and for a moment she felt a bit better. Her phone rang louder than she thought it would. Everyone turned to look at her, and she fumbled with it while trying to wash the muffin down with some milk. "Hello," she said between sips. "Christina?" That was Mike's voice. "Mike!" Again, everyone turned and looked at her, only this time she didn't care. "Oh my God, where are you? Are you safe? Did they get you out of there?" "I'm fine. Are you in Seattle?" "Yes, I'm in the regional headquarters office right now. I just landed," Serenity said. "Wait, how did you know?" "I'll explain later, but I'm glad I found you," Carlson said. "Where are you? I have to see you." Serenity stood up, walking out of the cafeteria, ignoring the food she didn't finish. "I just walked out of the cafeteria." "Go back to the terminals. I'll head your direction," Mike said. "How did you find me?" Serenity started walking as fast as she could. "I saw a pad of paper and noticed Seattle on it. I hoped it was your orders," Mike said. "I had to call about 20 people since I landed here to get someone who had your number." Serenity saw Mike walking down the hall towards her. She took the phone away from her ear and made eye contact. Then she ran. Carlson barely had time to react as she jumped on him. Carlson stumbled back but managed to hold on to her as she wrapped herself around him. She squeezed him so tight, and when she finally pulled back, she kissed him. "I've never been so glad to see anyone," Carlson said. Serenity smiled. "I don't ever want to be apart from you again." And that, folks, is the end of Chapter 3. So we will pick up with Chapter 4 next week. I hope you guys are enjoying it as it starts out. And are enjoying the Richard Reads. Like I said, we'll be back next week at 6. Unless something comes up, but I don't expect that to be the case. I want to thank everybody for taking the time to come and listen to there we go. It won't let me close my own thing. I just want to thank everybody who takes a moment to come and listen to me and enjoy the readings. I enjoy doing them. It's definitely given me inspiration to continue the work on the novels. You know, like I said, this one came out in 2017. I haven't published a novel since. So I've been in a little bit of a rut, and so reading these really does help. So thanks a lot for hanging out, guys. I really appreciate it. I hope everybody has a good rest of the night, and if we don't talk to you in some of our streams later, I hope to see you back next week. Thanks, everybody.